I'm Chris from airwindows, and as usual, I have a plugin. This time it's a new plugin. This is something that I worked up when I was running experiments on my plugin Average, because I was thinking, well, if it does this funny thing with the nodes and stuff, bizarre response curve on, say, span here, what if I did one where the um, average factor just sort of started off, and rather than going in a rectangular form and stopping, it just gradually tapered off, but not in an IIR format. An IIR format would be gradually tapering off in such a way that it would make a kind of exponential curve. No, more like a what's called an FIR filter, which is I I've been saying IIR and FIR. I suppose I should explain what that means to a plugin maven such as myself, or a digital audio a DSP guy. What those mean are kinds of filters. And IIR means infinite impulse response. What that means is you've got something that's acting kind of like a reverb trail or whatever. You activate it, and it goes zap, and then the effect kind of fades off gradually and technically never quite goes away. If the resolution of your numbers is high enough, it'll fade off and just keep fading forever. FIR is different. FIR is finite impulse response. And what that gives you is a sound that comes in and it'll do whatever is within the space that the sound is working, and then it's gone again. It's not there. Now, I like the sound of IIR filters, but that doesn't mean, an IIR low-pass filter is just one particular sound. You can have more than that, and this is what I'm demonstrating with ToneSlant. Here's what ToneSlant does. I'll turn on the pad here. Maybe turn it down a little bit more because we don't really need to hear this. And ToneSlant is here. You got your voice in control. It goes up to a lot more taps than Average, because Average is an earlier implementation of this. And you've got a highs control, which is adds or subtracts. And the end result of this is, here, we'll let you hear it a little bit more while talking about it. If we add highs with this, sort of the whole area of it gets boosted up somewhat, whereas if we subtract highs, they can pretty well go right away. Now, the reason the way this works is through that averaging idea, where we're taking samples and combining them. And because they're not a traditional digital filter that does things like run latency, this has no latency at all, or works to deliver a particular waveform, those will often have ripple in the response. You will look at what you'd get if you sent like a single sample tick through it, and you'll get a sort of wiggle around the sides of it. In some ways, that's just part of what the waveform is. Like if you take a square wave waveform and removed all of the super high frequencies from the concept of a ultimate perfectly square wave waveform, what's left is actually a square in which the edges start to wiggle a little bit more until they swoop down and to the next position, and then wiggle their way out of that, and then get going again before they go across to the wiggles of that are literally what's left behind after you take out the super high frequencies. But a bizarre FIR filter like this, and ToneSlant is actually an FIR filter. It's a little over 100 taps, and we get to use 100 taps on it. They might not all be at full volume. They might not be a fancy shape, but the input ripple is basically zilch. There's none. As such, what we've got is when it's at -1 for highs, that's literally the output of the effect. This is the full extent of your averaging in place. And as you can see, and I like to hold down the Option key while adjusting it like it says for fine adjustment. It's a nice logic tip. It's very useful. Works in AU Lab for anybody that's using AU Lab. We start to see it turning down at the extreme highs in a way that's very similar to what average did. I mean, that is pretty much what we're used to see. And then we're even seeing some of the same effects, like beginnings of a node happening. But that's not going to go much farther because the way that ToneSlant has the samples fall off means that it quickly makes that go away again. As such, we can start taking it down. And we'll quickly get to a point where we're just sloping the extreme highs away and leaving only some mid-range. It very quickly goes all the way into the bass. And since this is essentially modified dry-wet control, we can go from dry, which is essentially highs being changed by 0. There's only one mathematical add being done to apply this to the signal. So what that means basically is if we are doing small amounts of this effect in order to just not overwhelm everything, that makes this a pretty good mastering EQ for when you need just an overall slant at some corner point. Now, unlike other stuff that I'm going to be talking about in other videos, this one doesn't try to do an overall, I mean, it's called ToneSlant, but it's not trying to bring the bass up or anything like that. It's meant to be a lot simpler. And as such, we can sort of gently cool it off. We're getting a bit of the upward slant of the dry signal because we're not quite, well, I'll show you what happens. We can keep affecting it. And we get this sort of counter slant. Now, when you combine that with the dry, it doesn't mean it's going to become flat. What it means is it's going to be kind of a hybrid. You're going to have some of the downward slant and then a little bit of the upward slant, but maybe not quite as much as the unaltered effect. And the reason I'm not going and doing everything that I can to make the spectrum analyzer result what one would want is that this is designed around, it's kind of like my purist plugins. It's designed around being able to add an effect that's not going to hurt the tone of the sound in the slightest bit. So if you wanted to take, say, music, for instance, and apply this slant to it, for instance, here's music of a sort. Now let's add that slant. And it's obviously an effect. But kind of all of our tonalities here those tonalities aren't really being touched by ToneSlant. It's literally just taking the overall balance of things. And the corner point that I choose, 50 taps, is rather a lot. Here, I'll show you what it's like when you push it all the way to the extremes. Our total cancellation is here. So it goes from up here down to the lower mids already, even at 30 or so. All the way down to 100 taps. Now, interestingly, that serves as almost like a bass boost. It's a fairly gentle roll-off, but the interesting thing about it is it's extremely well behaved with the deep, deep subsonics. It's not hyping them out in any way. You have no resonance, you have no exaggeration. It's literally behaving just like the raw tone. As such, if you're using it to serve as a kind of low frequency boost, what you can do is go back to 0 again, and then just start dialing it back a little bit. And you're getting a kind of you're getting to pad it down, but we're retaining the lows that we want. This is a very clean, it's kind of like it's not unlike what a classic Pultec passive analog EQ does, because there's always been some circuits, and a Pultec is one of them. And also Dave Collins did one called the Davalizer, which is not a Pultec, but it is also a very simple and well-designed equalizer. The idea is you can make these circuits that are very minimal and simple. They're not going to screw anything up for you by getting overcomplicated. And as a result, you can barely hear them in effect, even when they're doing a heck of a lot. I'll demonstrate again. Without it, and then we'll put it back in. Now, you wouldn't think that this was heavily EQ'd. Or how about this? You wouldn't automatically think that this is a huge, massive bass boost, and yet that's really a huge, massive bass boost. It's just happening in such a way that you're not hearing heavy EQing even when it's present. But there's actually even one more trick than that, and I'll show it to you. Guess what this does? Voicing exactly 1 tap, highs exactly 1, and that's a boost. Fooled you. Let's hold down Option and sneak the voicing just a bit off of 1. Interesting, huh? What we've got here is a funny little artifact. Here, I'm going to sneak this back a little bit, just so that I can talk easily over it, because it's just the faintest of highs. When I designed this and coded it up, I discovered that when you set it to 1 tap and full crank of highs, it happened to cancel itself out. Now, it's not necessarily an automatic thing that you're going to leave it that way. After all, nothing in the plugin says, oh, by the way, when you do this, it cancels itself out completely. But I'm keeping it because this is an interesting side effect. Like when you've got the unaffected stuff like here, and you can hit a button and boom. I have a feeling that this can be useful for people. You could compress it, you could do any number of things, but you'll notice that there is no spike, there's no unusual effect up in the extreme highs there. And then as we start bringing it out, and this is different from the stuff that my high pass and low pass does, all of these filters operate just a little bit differently. So you might end up developing preferences. This is going to be the one that I think mastering engineer types would like the best. And bear in mind, this is doing this tied to the sample rate. It'll still work on, say, 96K or up, but the range of taps and so on, it's going to give you slightly different effects, but the same basically untouchable clarity and transparency. I mean, you can just hear the clarity pouring off of this. We can bring a little boost and throw a gain boost on afterwards, and you're good to go. A little nice extreme highs boost that is very sort of organic sounding. But you can also bring it up by bringing the voicing in, because as you can see, we've got the full highs here. If we push it all the way to the 100 taps, it's making the corner point be down around the low frequencies again. And that's kind of just... that's not really as useful. Having a boost that's just coming from there, I don't think that's nearly as useful as cutting lows in another way. But we do have the whole mid-range area to work with. And that means we got a sort of slight darkness here. And this is ToneSlant. That's ToneSlant being used just as a kind of upper mid-range lift. Now, bear in mind, putting a digital EQ lift on upper mid-range is not an easy thing. It's almost always going to sound horrible because just digital EQs don't seem to like doing that very much. It's very easy to have them sound awful. ToneSlant is a little bit different than that. What we get is... now that's very upper treble, so I can hear it starting to affect the upper mids. And then we'll pause a little bit because, again, when you're doing little... and I got this from Tim Gillies, Slipperman. When you're doing a boost and altering that, and you take a little bit of it away, sometimes you go, oh, that's terrible, I can't lose that, that's no good at all. So you have to sort of stop and wait for a moment, recalibrate your ear, and then bring in the lesser amount from zero and get to a different place. So what we're going to do is, at this sort of upper mid-range boosty area, we're going to bring in the highest boost here and listen to how it sort of hypes those guitars and things just a little bit. And again, ToneSlant can be a little tricky to operate because if you're not focused on exactly where you're hearing it, and if you don't know what to listen for, you won't hear it even when it's adding dBs of gain. It's not going to bring any artifacts. It's not going to bring the coloration that one would normally expect from something like a high frequency or mid-range boost, especially in the digital domain. So it'll sound kind of like this. So that's a little bit more lively. That's what it was without it. And then we'll bring our boost back. And let's make it a little more trebly. more. And again, take it out. And this is the kind of boost I can add with ToneSlant. ToneSlant is an audio unit and Mac and PC VST. And ToneSlant, even though it might be the best EQ you could possibly use for professional level mastering with this kind of thing, and I say that because I know that there's pretty much no way to make it simpler, that the simpleness, just kind of like with the Pultec, is what protects the tonality in the sound. So it's not like you can add a bunch of stuff to make it more complicated and that's going to make it sound better. No, it doesn't work that way. And lastly, that it's running through the full, the purest line of plugins thing that I did, where it's doing the noise shaping to the 32-bit floating point bus, or indeed the 64-bit on the VSTs that use that. It's the whole 9 yards. It's everything that I can do, from 10 years of plugin experience of bringing the ultimate transparency and tonality to digital audio into this very simple little algorithm, which I've tweaked out to work in a number of useful ways. I don't think you can do better than this for EQs of this type. It is free because what I do these days is support my work with a Patreon. And the Patreon is designed to work its way up to the point where I can continue to live and do this work on it. Now, maybe it hasn't quite gotten up there as I speak. We're at something like $320 a month. People can't really live on $320 a month. I mean, I know where I can buy a 20-pound bag of rice for $4 from a really cool discount food place that I know. And I have done that. And I've cooked some of it today, and I'm going to be eating some of that 20-pound bag of rice today, just because I am that serious about hanging in there and making this work. But it's not supposed to stay at like $320 a month. So I figured that if I expect to get Patreon to work in such a way that a person can actually live on it over the long term, I kind of need to earn it. So ToneSlant is audio unit, Mac and PC VST, and it is free for all to use. Heck, at some point I'll start putting the open source out of these guys. And as I always say, and in this case I really mean it, and I'm talking to different people. Often I'm talking to like EDM producers who I love, but in this case I am talking to some pretty heavyweight mastering engineers and professional audio technicians. To you guys, I hope you like this. I made this one for you. Enjoy.